Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education certification course. Everyone can be seated. And for those of you that are messaging me from Mexico, hola, mi amigos. I see you. So it's always great to come up here, and when we start to teach this class, we will get messages from people all around the world letting us know they're ready for class. And that's always inspiring, from Africa to Europe. All over North and South America. It's very inspiring to see the work that was put together by an author who had a desire to help spread character education throughout society, and a team that came together to do it, and to see how far this program actually reaches. It's astounding to see these things. And then with technology, well, people around the world are just right at your fingertips. So it's always a great thing to see. So we're going to continue back in the self-control unit, and once again, that's the third of the 5 series of the junior high, and it's the most popular unit, but it's a unit that cannot stand alone. That's why we went through the character and the acceptance before this unit, and it's very important because, as the William and Catan went over, on page 4 of the character unit, it briefly states about what you've learned in the character unit. And the self-control unit here, that's what it states on page 4. So there's a lot of information we had to have in our minds to tie these things together. And a lot of people think that, well, if I can just have self-control, then I'll have it all worked out. Well, self-control of what? You have to kind of understand what character is and personality is, and the difference in between those two. And then, of course, the acceptance unit went into great detail about how it's not just accepting positive and negative, but it's also about accepting diversity, accepting people who might be making decisions or doing things differently than you or I, but they're not bringing any harm to themselves, someone else, or the environment, so that's okay. And that's something that the acceptance unit covers, along with us accepting that whenever we're around a group of people that are doing something wrong, we need to get away from that group of people. And we have to accept the fact that it's our decisions we make that will determine our future. Other people can do things that can cross paths with our interactions, and it can be a very horrific thing. But for the most part, you have to work on what you can control. And if each and every one of us can learn to control ourselves, then we'll make society a much better place. But for all of you that may not know or might not know, look down on the Facebook page. If you're watching online, you'll see the character PDF unit. There's an arrow there. If you click down, you'll be able to see the acceptance unit and the self-control PDF copies of the teacher's manuals, and you'll want to download those. And if you have any problems whatsoever, just message us at the official Peaceful Solution there on Facebook, and we'd be more than glad to assist you so you can download them, because they're very important for you to have when we're going through these classes, to put your notes together and also see how we're using the lesson plans the way it was laid out, and the intention and the purpose that was brought forth by the author and the group of teachers and parents that put this program together. It's very important that we adhere to the exact instruction, because that's when we get the most benefit from the program itself. Now we're going to be picking back up on page 11. If you could be turning over to LP1F, we're going to reread Procedure 3, and this is what David covered, and we'll do a little bit of review. He did a great job of expounding on a lot of things. I wrote down quite a few quotes that he gave in the class, and a lot of things in the self-control classes, as he was speaking about, you learn a lot through interaction when teaching schools. And I know the teachers that are watching and those who are training to be teachers, these things are very important when you can connect with students, because that's really first and foremost the challenge of a teacher, is to connect with the student. If you don't connect with the student through one form or fashion, it can be a challenge in educating them. And unlike our classes we're having here, this is a voluntary class, so people actually come to the class because they want to hear what the class is about. Well, in school, it's not necessarily that way. They go because the state law requires them to get an education and so forth. Parents send them to public school. We do a lot of homeschooling through our classes here. But this is the part where it can be a challenge in connecting with people who are in your class that don't necessarily think that what you're saying is even important. And it's a challenge because these things that we're covering, are literally the difference between having a life of peace or a life of hell. And it's always kind of humorous that you're never supposed to rest in peace until you die, right? And then rest in peace. Well, what we want to do is live in peace. That's the goal, is to live in peace and to have peace in our lives. Well, procedure 3, and once again, David covered this, and it said, emphasize to students that because self-control is so important to society, it is the first step of character development. Very important to remember. The character unit taught us about what character is, and remember, it's those morals. And on page 8, David went over that again, the dividing line that divides between right and wrong, and that's page 8 in the character unit. And of course, these morals, which are rules, they determine whether something is right or wrong. And the rules are based on whether they bring harm to someone, yourself, or the environment. And those rules are supposed to determine if they bring harm, then it's a no, or you shouldn't do it. If it doesn't bring harm, then it's okay to do. In society, we as society need to accept the fact that people have the right to do that. Whether someone wants to wear, purple shoes, pink shoes, green shoes, red shoes, people might do things that we necessarily don't like as far as our personalities, but other people do them, and it's not really something that's detrimental to society. It's not bringing harm, so that's something we need to learn to accept and see that there's no harm in those things. A lot of times in society, it's hard to determine who's right and who's wrong. And there's so much history sometimes in determining who's right and who's wrong. People often ask, what's an example you can give that everyone would know that they just can't agree? And the number one answer is always Israel and Palestine. And for as long as I've been alive, which is 49 years, I can remember Israel and Palestine always fighting with each other. I do not ever remember a time when they had peace. I remember them signing a peace agreement, but I don't remember it bringing peace. And I remember President Obama saying that agreements don't bring peace in themselves. It's a lot of hard work. People have to change lives. And that's the self-control we're talking about. I mean, you can even look into like Russia and Ukraine. And if you're old enough, you realize that, well, Russia and Ukraine used to be part of the USSR. They used to all be part of one country. And now you have the Baltic states divided up, along with Belarus and Armenia and all these other countries. And they used to be one, but now they're many. And now there's kind of a battle of who owns what. And it's very interesting to sit back and watch because both sides think they're right in all of these situations. And you can even go from there to, Syria and Israel, and you can go to South Sudan and Sudan, and there's just so many places you can go, even down to the southern border of the United States, which once was Mexico, now is the United States. People in Mexico don't agree with that. They feel it was stolen. And it becomes very difficult to determine, well, who's right, who's wrong? Where did it go right, and where did it go wrong? Well, these are things that we're trying to say on a foundational level. This building of self-control is what we need to do. And once we have a society that can start basing fundamental answers and ideas on peaceful solutions, we can actually start fixing all of these problems that have been broken over the years, hundreds of years, thousands of years. But you can actually go back and start fixing these things. And you can have people go, I don't think you could do that. Well, who's tried? Obviously, money doesn't fix problems. The United States sends money everywhere. Obviously, oil doesn't fix problems. People steal oil every day, and there's battles on oil every day. And obviously, the UN doesn't fix problems. They just had a shouting match there last week. There's a lot of failures in society, and I'm not blaming any of those organizations. But I'm saying that people should look more back at these rules and the adherence to these rules, morality. And that's what we're really going to be discussing once again tonight. This morality, when we say we have an immoral society, we're saying we have a society that does not adhere to the rules. Well, that a lot of people like to say, well, stolen sugar is sweeter. Or, well, one of the most positive character traits I like is forgiveness. Whatever I do, you're supposed to forgive me, and we're going to move along. But you have to remember, with forgiveness can come devastating results sometimes. If somebody runs a stop sign and causes a horrific car crash and injures someone severely, the person that was injured can still forgive the person that ran the stop sign, but it won't change the fact that they're injured severely. So there's still consequences that come with wrong decisions, even if the positive character trait of forgiven is used. There's still consequences that come with bad decisions, or even things that are possibly just honest mistakes. So once again here, we're going to emphasize the self-control unit is important to society, and the first step of character development is this self-control we're talking about. Now, he read through the importance of self-control, found on page 8, and self-control develops other traits, and that's found on page 10. So let's really quickly turn to page 8. And one of the things David said, I wrote down when I was watching the class, he said self-control is required to have a positive character. And that's something you need to challenge your students with. Ask them, do you really think self-control is required? Because required means it has to be there. It's just like if you want sweet tea, you have to put sugar in your tea. If you forget to put the sugar in the tea, you're going to know it really quickly when you go to drink the tea. So challenge them, and even though they're barely in the book, see what they're thinking. See what they're saying. See what they think self-control is. A lot of people really don't have a clue, and I'm not saying that to be insulting. I'm saying that because this is really the conversation of the peaceful solution, which seems very basic, very remedial, very everyday, is really not very everyday conversation amongst families, amongst schools, amongst society themselves. It's really not a part of the education that's going on in today society. But notice here on the top of page 8, it says self-control is needed in every situation. Challenge your students. Name one situation self-control is not needed, where someone can remember just live for the moment, do what you want to do, carefree. Just let your hair out and just take off and go off running. Do what you want to do. Notice here it said you need self-control whether you are alone or interacting with others, at school, home, work, or even when you're having fun. You got to have self-control when you're having fun? Well, have you ever, think about this for those of you that are older, have you ever had a time where you were having fun and you kind of lost the concept of the safety that was supposed to be involved in having fun and something really bad took place? I remember playing sports, having fun, broke collarbone, both ankles, pinky, thumb, wrist, and I did all that having fun. Wasn't too fun when I started breaking things. It's really not fun when it gets cold and you're older. But, we start thinking about these things and how in a split second of having fun, things are so detrimental. And then you think, well, why would I need to have self-control when I'm by myself? Remember the things we've covered, and all 4 teachers spoke about that over the course of the character and acceptance unit about what takes place with young people on the internet and how people can lure them in and very horrific things take place. There's also some very inappropriate content on the internet that scientifically has been proven to destroy minds. And that's something that people can argue the point, they can debate the point, but you can see the results of what takes place with this. And for those of you that might not understand, I'm talking about letting your children free on the computer and they end up on things like pornography, which is proven to destroy the mind, is more powerful in hurting the mind than cocaine itself. You're talking about an industry where a lot of the people that are in it working commit suicide or die from drug overdose or die from severe disease. Okay, so the lifestyle itself is not healthy, and then what are you teaching someone? If you're watching something where someone is bringing harm to themselves, that's not positive character. That's not beneficial. And you think, well, who didn't have the self-control whenever the child is at home by itself? Well, who's responsible for the content the child has access to? We can blame the children all we want to, but there comes a time the parents and teachers have to be responsible themselves. If you give a child a telephone or a cell phone with internet, you pretty much have given them something that can be a tool that can be rewarding or a tool that can be a death sentence. It can be one of each. It can be both also. So think about these things as we go through this, because David also talked about how self-control enables you to speak and behave appropriately regardless of the choices that are placed before you or the situation that you're in. And that means, the author of The Peaceful Solution told me one time, he said, everybody has things that irritate them. And one thing that irritates me is when something goes wrong, the first thing out of someone's mouth is another person's name. He said, I just like it if somebody would take responsibility one time. And I thought about that, and through my interactions, when things break, I've learned that that's very irritating whenever you're trying to find a solution to a problem, and the only thing you can get is someone else's name. And so I'm more worried about how this took place. Not who did it, not yet anyway. We'll get to that later. But how did it take place? The who, what, where, why, how's usually last. But you get into these things, and this is all part of self-control. Taking responsibility for what we do. He also read, if you look over here to page 9, at the very top, it said, now that you're growing up, it's up to you to take the responsibility for keeping yourself in control. And remember what we read about on page 60 of the character unit with influences, and how you're to never underestimate the power of an influence, and how the power they have in our decision making, our choices. And we also talked about that with making friends in the acceptance unit, and how friends can tend to influence us through peer pressure and conformity, and how people can give in to do things that they normally wouldn't do through this influence and conformity. Well, when someone is working to develop, and that's something that has to be really understood, working to develop. Self-control is not something you read it, controlling myself. Well, got that down. Okay, next subject. It's something that can take a lifetime to develop. And, you can let your guard down in any instance, and you're out of control. And you're bringing harm to other people and yourself. And all of these things that take place can be extremely detrimental to our character. But once again, if you notice here, it says you can no longer expect your parents and teachers to remind you of proper behavior. You should now be able to distinguish between right and wrong. Well, why should you? Because you've been through the character unit and the acceptance unit. That's why those units are so important. Those were two units that foundationally laid the difference between what is right and what is wrong, what you should accept and what you should reject, things you should do and things you should not do. And it's very important because in the self-control, remember chapter 3 of the character unit, the making of a VIP, and how we make things a habit is we value them. And remember what values were on page 6 of the character unit is something that's important to us. Well, a positive character is what the Peaceful Solution is saying that should be the most important, and everything else can fall in its group, along with importance. But without a positive character, everything else all your goals, all your expectations can crumble by the wayside. And we can go through a whole life of wanting to accomplish things, but never really getting anywhere in life because we didn't do it in a positive manner. But looking at the next paragraph here, it says, even though you have been developing, growing, maturing, and that's not just with age, that's also with character. Developing self-control through the guidance of the adults in your life, and that's if you've had positive adults in your life. There's some people that have adults that don't practice self-control, and they're out of control. And that's also something we covered in chapter 2 of the character unit with All in the Family. Not everyone is in the ideal family. Some people don't have an idea what it's like to have a mother or a father or parents in general. Some people can go through an entire life and not really have an idea what that's like. So we have to realize that what our ideas of what a family life is like usually comes from the family life we had. But we have to remember not everyone has this ideal life. And you can have both parents, and you can have the, nice house with a white picket fence and the, 2-story dormers on the front. It can be all of these great things, but you can still have a lot of negative things taking place in an ideal household. And if you remember, we covered in Chapter 2 of the character unit that most families are not positive or negative. They're somewhere in between. They're a lot of positive and a little negative, or a mixture of both. But there's still a mixture there that causes problems to arise and situations to arise. Looking down at the next paragraph, it says, self-control must come from within you and must be practiced consistently. So once again, you can't wait for someone else to help you develop self-control. It has to come from within us, so it comes from within us outwardly. You can't wait for someone else to control themselves, and then you'll control yourself. And we'll get into the anger triggers and all those other things that will help bring these things together. But once again, it must come from within you and be practiced consistently. Remember, value, imitate, practice. And looking down a little bit further, about midway into the paragraph there, it says, if you are respectful to adults while in their presence, but disrespectful when they're not around, then you're not consistently practicing self-control to maintain the character trait of respect. And that's not just for students talking to their parents. That could be an employee-supervisor relationship. It could be a teacher-student relationship. It could be just one person to the next person relationship. It's always said by people who promote positive character, and this is something that you try to think of consistently, that if you say something about somebody and you thought that they were around the other side of the wall listening and they could actually hear what you said, would you actually say it the same way? Would you say it differently if they could hear you say it? And that's something that we all need to put into play, practicing on the things we say about others. Would we actually say it that way? Because that could help the way we think and the things that we say, our actions that come forth from those thoughts. So turning over here to page 10, once again, you'll see here, developing and practicing self-control will enable you to develop, once again, developing and practicing, so letting it grow, working on it. This is a lot of work that has to be put into play. It will enable us to develop many other traits. But the first thing we have to do is start developing the self-control. Being able to accept what is right and what is wrong, what brings harm, also what can cause harm, and what we allow to be in our kind of circle that we have there, what we allow into our lives, whether it be education or relationships. And then if you look at the next sentence, it says self-control is the foundation of a positive character. And by the time you've read that on page 10, it should really be setting in, because that's the third time you would have read that very same phrase. It's also spoken of on page 3 and page 4 of the self-control unit. So once again, self-control is the foundation of a positive character. You cannot have or develop or grow a positive character without controlling yourself. And controlling ourselves is the influences we talked about in the character unit, making sure that we alleviate the negative, and it's okay to accept the positive influences, but we need to get rid of the negative. And we even talk about how music influences us, movies, entertainment in general, not just Friends, but we also talked about how the sounds of certain things influence us. You hear if you're a guy and you hear that hot rod go by or that sports car go by, to grab your attention. And there's other things that we won't get into in this class that can grab your attention just from the way it sounds. We also talked about how things grab your attention from the way it smells. And we talked about cooking and bringing back memories of, something you might have done with your grandmother or your mother or your father or whoever you shared these things with. All of these things play a huge part in our database that we call a brain, where we pull all of these memories from. And of course, we probably have some bad experiences that we all could share but we'd much rather share the positive things that we've experienced in life and how we got rid of the negative things. And that's really what we want to concentrate on tonight in looking over at page 11. This gets us into procedure 4. So if you put your finger there on page 11, we're going to go back and read procedure 4. And keeping in mind that, you know, and I know every teacher has said this so far when it comes to foundation, but, you know, I say build a house. Not everybody builds a house, but everybody lives in something. You know, you live in, one person told me one time, I'm homeless. I said, where do you live? I live under a bridge. Okay, let's talk about a bridge. You ever seen a bridge fall apart? One just fell apart in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or in Pennsylvania somewhere here not long ago. You know, if it's not stable, do you want to live underneath the bridge? And he actually said, he goes, you know, I actually moved from one bridge to another because I thought the bridge was going to fall down. When those big trucks came across it, it sounded like the bridge was going to collapse on me. But he was perfectly joyful with his life. I mean, I was actually shocked. This guy just enjoyed. Now, he was in a warm part of the world. He didn't live in the United States, and we were in a different country, but he was very, and the weather was very nice, so I could see where he wouldn't get cold. But even he could understand how foundational things are very important. But you think about whether your house, and that's usually what you think of. You know, there's a high-rise building in San Francisco that will probably be used as a great example in the Peaceful Solution for many years to come, about how hundreds of millions of dollars can be poured into making these just beautiful, extravagant condominiums. But when they first started, the foundational footers were not put in correctly, and now the building literally leans 2 foot from center right now. And every year it leans more and more and more. And it's in the middle of downtown San Francisco, and they have no idea what they're going to do with it. Because if it falls to one side, it crushes the bus station, other high-rise buildings. And what do? How do you straighten up a high-rise building that has no foundation in it? Very difficult to do. Very complicated to do. You know, and if you've never read about it, we'll bring more on it, and I'll try to bring some more on it the next class. But read about it and look at the challenges these men are facing and women are facing with trying to right something that was wrong, because people are living in this thing. It's not something that was just built recently. This is something that's, you know, about 20 years old, 15 years old, but it's, you know, people bought condominiums in these places. And there's a lot of money been spent on this. And you think about, well, how can that building compare to my life? Well, live your life out of control and then try to fix it after it went wrong. You know, try to fix yourself and want a life when you're sitting behind bars 30 years. Try to fix something after you've done something that's very devastating to where it brought you severe bodily harm, or you brought someone else severe bodily harm, or even death. It's best to work these things out, consider all of the consequences. You know, in that building, there was probably, you know, you build buildings and you sell things for profit. And you can overkill anything and spend too much money and go to sell things and lose money because you spent too much building it very firmly. Well, your character only takes time, and you'll never regret spending the time to build your character. We won't regret the time building our character because we can benefit for a lifetime. But if we ignore these things, it's much worse than a building that's leaning over. It's much, much worse. We're talking about our very lives. So here in Procedure 4, it says, explain to students that it's not enough to just understand the importance of self-control. They will also be taught how to practice self-control. And once again, if you don't have it there, you can write the note for VIP. That's Chapter 3 of the Character Unit. That's Value, Imitate, Practice, and that's where we covered how valuing things that are positive, imitating them and practicing them, putting them to work in our lives, help them become a habit to us. So if you don't have it there, that way you can refer back to it, because that's a great chapter to put in our minds as teachers and also to recall back to the minds of our students. In fact, I'll read to you one thing here. This is Chapter 3 of the Character Unit. And at the very beginning, it says Chapter 3, the making of a VIP. And at the very bottom, it says, measure yourself by the things you value. We live in a world of constant interaction. These interactions interactions influence the way we think, feel, and act, and ultimately what we value. So very important, because a lot of people, and for your notes, that's page 55. It's the very first page of chapter 3. A lot of people think that our values come first, and then we determine what we want to do after that. But that's not so. Once again, it says that the interactions, the influences, the way we think, feel, and act, they ultimately influence what we value. So here the things we participate in can influence us to do some very negative things. And it says influences can have either a positive or negative effect on your character. It's up to you to be aware of how these influences will affect what you value and your choice to obtain a positive character. And tying those things together, because you look at people when they value things, and some people, you kind of, some things you get from your family. Growing up, I think my family, I think we had a Whirlpool refrigerator. So to me, I thought Whirlpool was the best refrigerator they made. And since I've become an adult, I don't think I've bought a Whirlpool refrigerator, but I've bought a bunch of refrigerators because they break really quickly. And it could have something to do with people using the door for swings. I would think that would probably be the number one cause. But nonetheless, I haven't bought a Whirlpool. Possibly a Whirlpool would do better. I don't know. But I remember, growing up that I was always, I loved Chevy trucks. Never drove one, but I loved them. Why? Because my dad drove a Chevy truck. And I remember being influenced by all of these things. And I also remember being a young person and seeing these Maytag commercials where it's like, wow, Maytag never breaks. That guy never has to fix anything. So I did eventually buy something that was Maytag, and it broke, and I had to have it fixed. So the Maytag guy does actually fix things. But I remember watching all these things as a young person and seeing these things, even being influenced to, sports is something that's very influential. And I grew up in North Carolina, and I'll just tell you this because I still can't even explain it. When I was a young boy, all the way up until I became disinterested in sports about 15, 20 years ago, I was a huge Dallas Cowboy fan. And that's all I wanted to do was watch the Dallas Cowboys play. Didn't get that from my father. He was a huge Green Bay Packer fan. My oldest brother was a huge Denver Bronco fan. And I cannot tell you to this day why I was a Dallas Cowboy fan. I have no earthly idea why. Because no one in my family was a Dallas Cowboy fan. And I've actually thought about, because my friends, we used to really get into some heated discussions because my closest friend was a Washington Redskin fan, or a Washington football team, or Commanders, or whatever they call themselves these days. And I still to this day can't even begin to explain why I decided I liked them. I really don't have a clue. And I really wonder how many more things in life take place like that we're just influenced in a way we don't know, but we really dedicate ourselves to it. And my quarterback's the best. Well, unless he gets traded, he's in another uniform, then he's not great anymore. But you look at what takes place, and we're going to get into this guarding your mind, because if you watch the news, if you haven't seen it, watch the horrific actions that took place at the last football game in Los Angeles, where another person was beat to the point where he's in a coma. This is not a rare thing, especially in Los Angeles, where people, because of two football teams playing a game, and those people playing the game, when you watch a football game, and this is what caused me to become very disinterested, when you're watching a game and everyone you see is a millionaire, and I'm poor and I had to work very hard to pay for my ticket to come watch millionaires play a sport that I played out in the yard, and that influenced me to not have any desire to watch it anymore. But you're talking about people that went to a game to watch people throw a ball, and they're so influenced by this game, they had an argument, got into a fight, carried on to the parking lot, and they beat someone pretty close to death over a game. Now, that's what occurs when people lose control. That's what occurs when you're having fun and you don't practice self-control. And I think those people, if that man was to die, I think those people will really, really regret it, because then they're going to be charged with murder. And that's a very life-changing situation. So once again, here back to procedure 4, the second sentence, it says, they will now be taught how to practice self-control. Tell students that they will consciously begin to develop self-control by learning to control their thoughts. That's very important, learning to control their thoughts, because we're going to, as we've already discussed so far, the self-control unit really gets into everything begins with a thought. And you'll have students that will challenge you and go, oh, no, 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 no. I do things all the time. I don't think about them. Challenge them. Well, do something without thinking about it. And you'll find that they eventually give in, because you have to think about everything you do. You know, and you hear people go, I just wasn't thinking. We'll get into that later, but we'll get that covered. But once again, it's to stress that thoughts lead to feelings, which lead to actions. Instruct students to read the section entitled Guard Your Mind, found on page 11. Allow time for students to share their answers. So turning back over to page 11 with a section entitled Guard Your Mind. And starting out at the very top, it says, another key concept in developing self-control is to be aware that your actions begin with your thoughts. And really engage your students. Create something, a conversation to, you know, a lot of them, you know, I didn't think about anything this morning. Well, you picked a shirt, you put it on, right? Yeah. Did you think about it? Yeah. Did you eat breakfast this morning? No. Did you decide you didn't want to eat breakfast this morning? Yeah. Well, tell me something you didn't think about. Just for the fact they have to think about it makes it very difficult to come up with an answer, doesn't it? You know, and we need to examine ourselves, because a lot of times when something breaks, something goes wrong, you know, somebody would come to you, well, how did that take place? I don't know, I wasn't even thinking. I've said that myself many times, and that's not really true. You know, thoughts are processed very quickly, as we'll learn. Once again here, it's very easy to say, I just did it. I wasn't thinking. But the truth is, we're always thinking. Thoughts enter our minds at the speed of light. Thoughts about ourselves, others, things we need to accomplish, and things we want. And one way you can tell, and I've noticed getting older, this is more common. Have you ever got to where you're in a room and you're like, oh, man, I got to go all the way back in the other room and get that. Then you go all the way back into the other room and you're stopping. Why did I come in here for? And it becomes embarrassing, because it's kind of like when I search for my glasses and they're on my head, or I look for my car keys. And I'll share this with you just so you can see how ignorant we can be. We have a van we use for the Peaceful Solution, and it's set one time. We didn't go anywhere on a trip for a couple months, and I couldn't find the key anywhere. So I went and had another key made and spent a lot of money, and they said, well, when you take it, it's got a little remote in it. You're going to have to program it to your van. I'm like, okay, I can do that. So I drove back. I got in the van. And now, this is weeks between this initial couldn't find the key. Got into the van, got the piece of paper out, went to stick my key in, and it hit the other key. It was in the ignition the whole time. You know, if I would have just been responsible and thought, well, that bell keeps going off every time I open the door. That's supposed to be telling me something. You know, that ding, ding, ding. Well, yeah, your key's still in there. And so now I have a spare key, but it came through not really, you know, concentrating and thinking about what was being done. Because if you consider the thought process that went into that, well, if the key is missing, where's the first place you probably should check? Well, where it's used, right? Go see if you left it in the ignition. Well, I didn't do that. Very interesting situations I've had in my life with keys. You know, they have these new keys now to where you just push a button to crank the vehicle. And I was way out in the country, and I got out and I went through the woods looking at some property, got back in my vehicle, went to push the button. Like, I lost my key. It was only to the next day I realized it was the radio button I was pushing the whole time and not the start button. But someone was nice enough to bring my other key all the way out to where I was at. So, you know, these are things that You don't laugh about them. I can laugh with you, but I wasn't laughing when it took place. But, I really sat there and I kept thinking, how could I have lost my key? Because I know I had it. I had to crank the vehicle to leave. And you start thinking, well, did I even have it to begin with? Well, yeah, you couldn't have drove there if you didn't have it to begin with. But these odd things start coming up in your mind, and reasoning kind of leaves us very quickly. It's like when I just got to get that. I can't believe I left it. You go into the other room. I don't remember why I even came in here. I came to get something. Don't remember what it was. It's a very common thing. I hope it's not just me. I hope other people can relate to that. So once again, it's very easy to say, I just did it, I wasn't thinking. But once again, the truth is thoughts enter our mind at the speed of light. And these thoughts about ourselves and others and the things we need to accomplish and the things we want, those are come through by influences that also enter our minds at the speed of light. These thoughts then lead to feelings, which in turn can lead to behavior. And you think about how technology has developed these things to where if you go on a news source and you start seeing all these pop-up ads that come up on your news sources that you go on to. Judge Report's a very popular one that these pop-up ads start changing. And these pop-up ads are all based on what you were looking at in the previous sessions you were on the internet. Whether you were trying to buy something, I was looking at solar well pumps here not long ago, and now every time I go on Drudge, all I get is these ads for solar well pumps. And it's very common. But these things, these little ads, they flash and they go away. They flash and they go away. And people spend a lot of money because remember what we covered about the soft drink in the movie theater where they just flashed it on the screen for a second, pulled it off. Most people didn't even realize that they had seen it, and they naturally wanted to go get themselves a soft drink. Well, people are very mindful of that, so they'll flash it there for you to, it's always, it's like, buy me, buy me. When it's something you need, well, that's when you're using self-control. When it's something you want and you buy it and it ends up in a shed somewhere in 3 weeks, that's probably not self-control. That's losing control there when you do that. As the author of The Peaceful Solution said, that when you're buying so many things, you're going shopping for a storage building because you got nowhere to put all the things you bought, that's time to start going through and developing some self-control because you're out of control with spending. And we can all do that very easily. You just got to have that tool, and then can't even remember why you bought the tool or any other thing for that instance. But once again, these thoughts, they lead to feelings, which in turn can lead to behavior. There's no surprise that sad thoughts make you feel sad. So how do people act when they feel sad? And engage your students. Ask them, how do you feel when you feel sad? What are some things that you normally do? Some people, let's read this. It says, many people mope or cry, even isolate themselves from friends and family. Your thoughts are powerful, and that's something to never underestimate. Our thoughts are extremely powerful. I've been in juvenile detention centers with young people and I'll never forget the story of a young man in Laredo. We were down there teaching, and I asked him, I said, what are you even here for? 14 years old. He's 13 or 14. He was going to be tried as an adult. And he goes, murder. That's what I'm in here for. I'm not going anywhere. And I asked him, I said, let me ask you, what led to it? Well, he got hooked in with a cartel down in that area, and he was delivering drugs. And some drugs got stole from him, and it is not the right answer to go back and say, I don't have money, the drugs got stole. He said, you just don't do that. So you go and you try to scare the people into giving you money. So he did that. He ended up shooting the person. And I asked him, I said, how long did you actually consider in your mind that you were going to shoot the person before you did it? And he said, my intentions was to scare the person. I think I honestly thought about shooting them probably for a second when I pulled the trigger, and I immediately thought I shouldn't have done it. He said, but probably 1 or 2 seconds is the only thing that ever entered my mind. I'm going to shoot them. But those 1 or 2 seconds changed their life forever. And these thoughts are so powerful because, thoughts of giving up, thoughts of I can't do it, thoughts that I'll never get anywhere. these things can hold us back from accomplishing the very things that we set out to do. You know, it's never a positive thing to spend many, many years trying to accomplish a goal and get right to the end and give up and walk away. You know, because that's actually a lack of self-control. You have to remember what got us to the point to where we wanted to accomplish this goal to begin with. Well, it's our thoughts and the influences that are around us, the things we allow into our lives. And our thoughts are very powerful for the fact that they'll lead to our actions. If they're negative thoughts, you'll have negative actions if you dwell on them. And we'll cover that. But once again, your thoughts are powerful. Don't underestimate the effects your thoughts can have on your feelings and your behavior. I know a lot of people, when they get sad, they get angry. And they get resentful. And they lash out at people. Some people isolate themselves. Some people see no hope to move forward when they're sad because things can be very devastating. But once again, we always have to focus on the goal at hand. And we all have goals. And we should be, by this time, after going through the acceptance unit, we should have positive goals that we already have written down. Because remember, we said that those who accomplish goals write them down. That's one of the things that people do who want to accomplish things. You write them down. I remember the author of The Peaceful Solution saying, write it on your bathroom mirror if you got to. You know, just put it somewhere. Everybody likes to go look at themselves at least one time a day. Put it there. You'll read it. And these things can be very handy. You know, he also gave in a seminar, The Peaceful Solution, that we were having one time, he was talking about how just take one thing that you're working on and write it down in an index card and put it in your pocket. And pull it out and read it as many times as you can during the day, and it will become a part of you, even if it's reminding you to do something. You know, it could be something very simple, things that we're lacking in, just to remind us to do these things, to accomplish positive goals, to do positive things in our life, and that repetition was us reminding ourselves, you know, of what to do and how to do them. But once again here, notice it's up to you to determine if your thoughts can help you to build your character or if they can lead to choices that you will regret. Although thoughts flow in and out of our minds, we have the power to control what thoughts we focus on and what thoughts we let go. So very important to remember that. Many things can enter our mind. That doesn't mean we have to dwell on them. We can have many negative things enter into our mind. But if we're practicing the peaceful solution, if we're practicing a positive character, we push those thoughts back out. And we recognize those thoughts. Like, let's just, an example, any negative thought. Each individual in here can consider, and those watching around the world, everybody can have their own opinion of what a negative thought is. But just think, you know, I'm not trying to get you to think negative, but a negative thought that enters your mind often. Let's just look at it that way. Something that we all have a challenge with. And then start identifying why it's negative. This is why this thought is negative. And start going over, this is why I shouldn't do this, I shouldn't do that, I shouldn't do this. And this is why I choose not to do it. And that's the process where we remind ourselves why we don't do negative things. And that's how we alleviate negative thoughts. Because if you dwell on it and you go, probably wouldn't hurt. Everybody else is doing it. I should try it too. Everybody else, not everybody else is doing something. If somebody ever tells you everybody's doing it, if everybody was doing something, we would have unity in this world, and we don't have unity in this world, okay? No way, no how. There's not one thing you can find this whole world, every person, all 8 billion people in unity with. You can find a disagreement probably within a block of where you're standing, and that's guaranteed. But these thoughts and these negative thoughts that come into our minds, it's what we dwell on. And that can be listening to remember we talked about music that teaches us to do things that would send you to prison. When you keep replaying that and singing along with it, well, that's not removing negative thoughts. That's practicing doing negative things. When we go on the internet and we look at inappropriate, explicit things, that's practicing putting those thoughts in our mind. We're talking about removing them. So if you see something that's negative, turn your head. Remind yourself why it's negative. Remind yourself of the consequences that come from those thoughts, and then move along. And that will help us. That's part of developing the self-control. And eventually we can get those thoughts completely out of our mind to the point where we can conquer things like that. But once again here, people that focus on negative thoughts about themselves and others or about the things they want to do are setting themselves up to fail and to engage in behavior they will eventually regret. And there was an article I was just reading to a group of people here not long ago about a new strain of HIV that's supposed to be 6 times stronger than the currently known strain of HIV. The thing I think that caught my attention in the article the most was, even though it's 6 times stronger, the article said there's most likely estimated 45 million people that have this strand that have no idea they have it. Now, can you look at someone and tell whether they have it or not? I can't. And I don't want to find out through a test that's being done on me that, oh, I guess they did have it. That's not a way in life we want to learn stuff. And if we're having thoughts, and we've covered things in detail, William and Catan both covered them in detail about sexually explicit things that take place in people's lives that immediately can lead to regret because of disease and other horrific actions. And we also covered very detailed about the millions of deaths that are taking place every year due to irresponsibility of bringing forth children and then people not wanting them. So they decide to end it before it ever starts. We fight for people who commit crimes and say the death sentence is something that should not be allowed, but for some reason we don't mind sentencing children to death and never have the opportunity to even make a bad choice. And that's a very confused society that sentences a child to death but fights for an adult to live. And I'm not saying adults should be sentenced to death. I'm just saying it's very confusing to want to sentence someone that hasn't made a bad choice but fight for someone that has. It's very confusing. Anybody can be taught. They just have to be taught. So continuing on here, it says, so how do you know if your thoughts are positive or negative? So here's how we're going to do it. Ask yourself if they will if they're harmful in any way, and that's yourself or someone else or the environment. That could be your community. Remember, don't just think of the environment as birds and air and trees. Think about your community, your family, your friends, the circle that you're within. It could be your state, your city, your county. All of these things play a part. Positive thoughts uphold true moral principles and will not cause you to bring harm to yourself or others. So one thing you can guarantee with that, if you practice positive thinking, you won't bring harm to someone else. Well, negative thoughts, on the other hand, notice they pave the way for destructive behavior. They are hateful, revengeful, and selfish. And these are things that we can all be because we're upset with someone. And the most popular thing was, well, they went and they made me mad. And we'll get to that. They made me mad, and we'll find out that no, those are negative thoughts that we're actually processing by blaming someone else, and it had to be someone else's fault. Because no way I could have possibly done this on my own. They made me do it. It's kind of the old saying, the devil made me do it. I remember trying to get by with that. My grandmother put that clear in my mind after I got a spanking. No, you chose to do it yourself. I could say the devil made me do it, but the devil did get the spanking. I can tell you that. And you think about these comments that we make, and we're kind of taught these things throughout life. And it's constantly a way of placing the blame on anybody but ourselves. And that's negative thinking also. It's not being responsible. So we're perfectly capable of making a mess on our own. We don't need assistance, even though we allow assistance to come in through influences. When we allow all of this negativity around us, we're very capable of doing really bad things on our own as a society. So once again here, notice, guard your mind by distinguishing between positive and negative thoughts. Consider the types of feelings and actions your thoughts can lead to. Once again, this developing, when we're considering these type of feelings and actions that our thoughts can lead to, remember the top of page 9. Going back over to page 9, and it says, now that you're growing up, and no matter how old you are, we're all still growing up, notice it's up to someone else to take responsibility for keeping yourself in control, right? That's what that says, right? It's someone else's job to keep you in self-control. That's right. It's up to you to take responsibility for keeping yourself in control. It's not really self-control if someone else is doing it, is it? Or as our friends down south say, auto-control. So everybody has this self-control that they need. Everyone needs to be able to put this to play in their life. And if someone else has to remind us continually, nothing wrong with reminding someone, but we've already talked about how you can't force someone to make the right choice. If you force your child to clean his room today, that doesn't mean he's going to clean his room tomorrow. You have to teach them why it's important, and they have to see all these benefits. I'm someone that I really like things that are very neat and organized, but I'm not a very neat and organized person. But I do like things that are neat and organized. I never tend to spend the time in one place long enough to organize, but I can sure spend enough time to mess it up. And I've learned that that's my way of trying to make excuses with, well, I don't have enough time to get all this stuff straight. I had enough time to mess it all up, and I've got some people in my life that will remind me of that too, because I'm very thankful that I have other people that tend to go behind me and organize things, that do it. And I have friends that are very organized, and those positive influences remind me every time I go to work with them and they're neat and organized that I should be too. But think about it. Now, this is conversations that we want to have with our students, and it says, think about a time when your thoughts led to certain feelings. How did you react? Write a short description explaining what occurred. So, here you have an activity, and you want to use this activity to engage with your students and to, conversate about what you've covered so far and what's been covered so far. We're only 11 pages into this, but there is so much information in the first 11 pages of this book. If we could just take, and I challenge anybody to this, if we just took the first 11 pages to this book and put it to play in society, we could change society for the better. You would have immediate results by people just putting these very basic foundational things into play. This is not a complicated thing in life that we have here. Making nuclear warheads that will fly on missiles at hypersonic speed, that's complicated. Making jets, that fly super speeds, submarines that go below wherever no man has gone before, these things are complicated. Sending a man into outer space, that's complicated. Getting along with your neighbor, that's not really so complicated if we just apply the rules. If we just put morality into society. I'm not sure we can put it back. I don't remember a time when society was peaceful. I remember a time when society wanted to be peaceful. In 1993, everybody had a hope of peace. Didn't work out too well. They signed peace treaties all the time. I remember the nuclear agreement with Iran that went away with the president and comes back with another president. So we think about these things and all of these things that are taking place in life, and we think about, well, why can we not have peace? I challenge anyone, the first 11 pages of this book would start peace in our society. And anyone that says it wouldn't, I would love for you to send us a message to the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program or there on our Facebook page and explain how this would not do so. Because it's a challenge that we put out there, because these are things that what we've covered thus far to page 11 lets us know that the reason society is like it is because we have made society what it is. And until we accept that it's our choices, our way of thinking, the things that we've done that has brought society to where it's at, there's no changing it. There's no putting it back or to a way of peace. So engage your students with that. In closing, look over to the note on the right-hand side here. It says, you are the only one who can control what you think. So choose your thoughts carefully. And how do you choose your thoughts? It could be, well, I want to watch a movie, a really action-packed movie. I want to see blood and guts. I want to play a video game where I get rewarded for stealing things. I want to live a life in virtual reality that I'd go to prison for if I actually did it in real life. But now they got these glasses you can put on and you can actually feel yourself doing it. What are we teaching and what are we putting in our minds? And how is that self-control when we've even created a virtual reality program so you can do things that are illegal? So it feels like you're right there. Think about how we're going as a society and why we're that way as a society. And once we start identifying why we're that way, we'll realize self-control has been removed from society in developing positive character. We're going to stop here on page 11. We only covered guard our mind, but next class we'll get to page 12 and we'll move along through there. Be your own best critic, not your worst, is what we're going to get to next. So keep your minds focused on that. Once again, try that note card in the pocket thing or doing something to help remind you of anything. Just one thing. You know, take everything day by day and every day try to improve one thing using self-control. So once again, our next class will be February the 9th at 5:30. I don't think we're going to have any more snowstorms, so we should be fine. February the 9th at 5:30, and we look forward to seeing you then.